Margaret Thompson, a 62-year-old retired elementary school teacher, was traveling in first class on a flight, a rare indulgence gifted to her by her son, David. As she settled into her spacious seat, she couldn't help but smile at the unexpected luxury. She had worked hard her whole life, raising children and educating others, and now she was finally able to enjoy some of the finer things in life. David had insisted that she take this trip in style, even though Margaret felt it was extravagant. She had always been more comfortable in modest settings, but this was different. This was a gift from her son, who had made it in the tech world and now wanted to share his success with her. As she sat back, appreciating the plush seat and the quiet comfort of first class, Margaret noticed the other passengers around her. The flight was nearly full, but most people seemed content to mind their own business. The feeling of peace, however, was short-lived as a woman in her mid-40s approached her. Margaret was momentarily caught off guard when the woman, whose name was Claire Mason, gestured toward Margaret's seat with a sharp, insistent voice. "I believe you're in my seat, ma'am," Claire said coldly, her gaze fixed firmly on Margaret. Claire Mason, a woman in her mid-40s, stood beside Margaret's seat with a condescending look on her face. "I'm afraid you're sitting in my spot," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. Margaret, slightly taken aback, glanced at the seat number on her ticket, confirming that she was indeed in the correct seat. But Claire didn't seem to care. She was already standing with her arms crossed, waiting for Margaret to vacate the seat. "I'm a Gold Elite member," Claire continued, her tone laced with authority. "I paid for this seat, and I should be sitting here. You should move to your assigned seat." Margaret's initial surprise quickly turned into confusion. She had never encountered anything like this before. She tried to explain that she was in the right seat, but Claire wasn't listening. The situation was escalating as Claire's behavior became more pointed, and her words became more hurtful. Margaret's calm and polite demeanor only seemed to frustrate Claire further. "Are you even supposed to be in first class?" Claire muttered under her breath. "People like you don't belong here." The implication in Claire's words stung, but Margaret maintained her composure. She had worked for years as a teacher, shaping young minds, and had earned this moment of peace. But Claire's assumptions about her place in the world were more than just frustrating, they were hurtful. Margaret chose not to retaliate, instead remaining calm, a quiet strength emanating from her. She knew better than to engage in the type of conflict Claire seemed eager to stir. At this point, the tension between them was palpable, and other passengers began to notice the exchange. Margaret was uncomfortable, but she remained resolute. She had earned her seat in more ways than one. As the confrontation continued to unfold, Margaret's resolve only deepened. She knew that Claire was acting out of assumptions, trying to impose her own idea of what was acceptable in first class. Margaret had spent her life being overlooked, underappreciated, and dismissed by people who held these narrow, discriminatory views of others. But she wasn't about to let Claire's judgment break her. Her years of experience in the classroom had taught her the value of patience and dignity in the face of adversity. As the situation escalated, the flight attendant, Robert, arrived at the scene. He had been observing the exchange from a distance and seemed to sense the growing tension. With professionalism and a calm demeanor, Robert approached the two women. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Margaret's voice remained calm, despite the unsettling situation. "I'm in the correct seat. This lady insists that I move, but I've already shown her my boarding pass." She looked up at Robert, who nodded in understanding before addressing Claire. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you're mistaken. This is Ms. Thompson's seat." "There's no need to escalate the situation," Robert explained, his tone diplomatic but clear. Claire's face flushed with frustration as she briefly glanced at Margaret, who remained quietly seated. Claire huffed and shook her head, clearly not satisfied with the resolution. But, sensing that her protests were futile, she muttered a few choice words and retreated to another seat, leaving Margaret and Robert standing in the midst of the tension. The flight attendant gave Margaret a respectful nod. "Thank you for your patience, Miss Thompson," Robert said. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Margaret gave a small smile, appreciating Robert's intervention. But as she settled back into her seat, a new feeling washed over her, one of quiet reflection. The sting of Claire's words lingered, but it wasn't the first time she'd encountered such judgments in her life. As the plane soared higher, Margaret thought about the experiences she had endured over the years, realizing how often she had been underestimated. She felt proud of her ability to stay calm, even in moments when others tried to put her in a box she didn't belong in. The confrontation had been unsettling, but it had also solidified something important in her, a sense of dignity that no one could take away from her. Looking out the window, Margaret's thoughts turned inward. She thought about her son, David, who had worked so hard to get her this far. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for him, for his success, and for the opportunities he had provided her with. Still, the question lingered: why was it that people felt entitled to impose their assumptions on others? Margaret knew that life was complicated, but she was no stranger to the emotional burden of being treated differently. It was a burden that could wear on anyone, but she had learned to carry it with grace. The tension in the air was thick, and for a few moments, neither Margaret nor Claire said a word. The flight attendant, Robert, had done his part, but the discomfort lingered between the two women. Margaret, while grateful for Robert's intervention, couldn't shake the sting of the words Claire had directed at her. She hadn't expected to face such overt disrespect, especially on a flight where she had expected a few hours of peace. Margaret remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on the seat in front of her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her chest. Her mind began to wander back to the days when she was a teacher, when she had dedicated herself to helping children, teaching them not just how to read and write, but how to navigate the complexities of the world, how to understand others and themselves. But as the years passed, she'd also come to understand something about human nature that no textbook could teach: the assumptions people make about others, often without reason or knowledge. That was the root of this confrontation. Claire's judgment of her had been based purely on assumptions rooted in the color of her skin and perhaps her age. She hadn't said anything at first, partly because it wasn't in her nature to create a scene. And partly because, deep down, she believed in confronting injustice in more subtle ways. Margaret wasn't someone who wanted to fight back with anger. She had learned long ago that dignity could be its own form of resistance, especially when the odds seemed stacked against you. However, what unsettled Margaret the most was the way she had been treated, not just by Claire, but by society at large. She had worked for years in a profession that demanded patience, resilience, and empathy. And yet, at this moment, she felt small. Her thoughts drifted to her son, David. He had earned everything he had, rising in the tech industry with his intelligence and hard work. But even now, as a successful entrepreneur, he carried the weight of the world's expectations. He was seen as someone who had made it. But Margaret, despite all her years of work, was still often judged by others based on her appearance and age, an assumption that didn't take into account the richness of her experiences. The calm, composed attitude she had managed to maintain throughout the confrontation slowly began to feel like an act, one she was tired of performing. Margaret knew that, in some ways, she had always been a part of a system that wasn't built to embrace people like her. She had become used to it, but it didn't make it any less painful. As she sat, her thoughts were interrupted by the voice of a familiar figure, the flight's captain. Michael, her son, had been in the cockpit the entire time, managing the flight from above. She hadn't expected to see him until they landed, but there he was, walking toward her from the cockpit, his presence like a breath of fresh air in the otherwise tense cabin. "Mom," he said softly as he approached her seat, a small smile on his face. His voice carried warmth and reassurance. "Is everything okay?" Margaret stood up, her body slightly stiff from sitting still for so long. She smiled at her son, grateful for his presence but unable to completely mask the frustration she was feeling. "Yes, everything's fine," she said, her voice steady. Just a little bit of a misunderstanding. Michael could see through her facade immediately. He had known her for 62 years, and he could tell when she was hiding something. "I don't think it was just a misunderstanding," he said, his tone now firm with a hint of concern. He turned his head to glance at Claire, who was sitting across the aisle, her eyes still locked on Margaret. "What happened?" Margaret explained the situation as briefly as she could, recounting the demands Claire had made and the way she had been made to feel out of place. As she spoke, Michael's face darkened with disbelief and then anger. He couldn't understand why anyone, especially someone in a position of privilege, would act in such a way. But he understood the deeper issue. This wasn't just about an assigned seat. It was about the way his mother had been treated as though she didn't belong, because of the color of her skin, her age, and the assumptions that people like Claire made about her. "I'm going to handle this," Michael said with a resolute tone. He looked over at Robert, who had been standing at the front of the plane, watching the exchange. Michael approached the flight attendant, who quickly met him at the aisle. "I'll handle it from here," Michael told Robert. Margaret looked at her son, both proud and overwhelmed by the wave of emotions washing over her. She had spent her life teaching him the value of kindness, fairness, and humility. But now, in this moment, she was about to witness him take those lessons and turn them into action. "Ma'am," Michael said, approaching Claire's seat with a professional, yet commanding presence. Claire had been watching him approach, her expression changing from smug to surprised. "Hi, I'm Michael Washington, the captain of this flight," he said, introducing himself in a calm, authoritative manner. "I just wanted to make it clear that my mother, Margaret Thompson, is in her rightful seat. She was given that seat based on her ticket, and as the captain of this flight, I'm confirming that this issue is resolved." Claire's face turned red, but she said nothing for a moment. Her eyes flicked between Michael and Margaret, a silent acknowledgement that the situation had spiraled beyond what she had expected. Finally, Claire opened her mouth, but the words that came out were anything but gracious. I didn't know," she muttered, her voice less certain now. "I just assumed," she trailed off, embarrassed by her own words. Michael's gaze remained steady, unfazed by her defensiveness. "Well, it's time to put assumptions aside," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "I hope you understand, we all deserve respect, no matter where we sit." With that, Michael turned to leave, giving Margaret a reassuring glance before heading back toward the cockpit. The tension in the cabin seemed to lift slightly, though Claire remained silent, no longer challenging Margaret. Margaret, watching her son walk away, felt a surge of pride mixed with an overwhelming sense of relief. She had raised him to understand the value of fairness and respect for all, and now he was standing up for her. She felt a deep appreciation for the way he had handled the situation with dignity, reminding her that, no matter how the world viewed her, she had people, like her son, who truly saw her. As the flight continued, Margaret settled back into her seat, the weight of the moment still lingering in her mind. She had faced the sting of prejudice head-on, but in the end, it was love and understanding that had won the day. The flight eventually landed, and the passengers began to slowly make their way off the plane. The hum of activity in the cabin seemed to fade away as Margaret remained seated, her hands folded in her lap. Her son, Michael, had already completed his duties and was now working with the flight crew to ensure everything went smoothly. The tension of the confrontation had not completely dissipated, but Margaret felt a deep sense of relief knowing her son had stood by her and had taken control of the situation. However, even as she walked toward the terminal, the weight of the incident lingered. She couldn't entirely shake the sting of Claire's words, nor could she forget the subtle but persistent feeling of being judged because of who she was, an older black woman, a retired teacher, someone often overlooked by a society that preferred to categorize people in narrow ways. After retrieving their luggage, Michael and Margaret made their way to the taxi stand. The bustling crowd in the airport felt overwhelming after the calm of the flight. Margaret leaned on her son's arm as they walked, grateful for his presence. As they stepped into the cab and settled in, the noise of the city around them faded into a soft hum, and Michael broke the silence. "Mom, I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said, his voice low but full of genuine concern. "I don't know why people like her feel the need to act that way." Margaret gave him a small smile, her eyes softening. "You don't need to apologize, Michael. You did what you could. I'm more concerned about how I feel about it all." She paused for a moment, staring out the window. "It's just tiring. After all these years, it never really goes away, does it? The judgment. The assumptions people make about us." Michael nodded, understanding all too well the emotional burden that came with living in a world where people were so quick to place others into boxes, to decide who belonged and who didn't. He had seen his mother face countless instances of discrimination in her life, and yet she had always carried herself with grace, never letting it stop her from doing what she loved, teaching and guiding the next generation. But as her son, it hurt him to know how much she had endured. He wanted to protect her from it, to shield her from the subtle biases that lurked in every corner of society. Yet he knew it wasn't always possible, and that realization left him feeling helpless at times. "It's just frustrating," Michael continued, his voice tinged with the anger he hadn't fully expressed. "Why do people think they can treat others like that? Like they're somehow less than they are?" His fingers gripped the seat of the cab as he spoke. "You've worked your whole life, Mom. You earned your seat. You've given so much to others. And then some random person just comes along and acts like you don't belong." Margaret leaned back in the seat, her thoughts heavy. "It's not just about this incident, David. It's about the bigger picture. The way society looks at people like me, the way they think that because I'm older, or because of my skin color, I don't deserve to occupy space in places that are meant for the elite." Her voice wavered for a brief moment, and she cleared her throat before continuing. "It's not the first time I've felt this way, and it probably won't be the last. But that doesn't make it any easier. The older I get, the more I realize that people don't always see me for who I am. They only see what they want to see. And sometimes, that's enough for them to decide I don't belong." Michael felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he listened to his mother. He had always admired her resilience and her ability to rise above the prejudices she faced, but hearing her speak so openly about the pain she carried made him realize just how much she had endured in silence. He had never truly understood the emotional toll it took on her, the constant strain of having to prove her worth to a world that wasn't always willing to give her a fair chance. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said softly, his voice full of regret. "I wish I could do more. I wish I could protect you from all of it." Margaret reached over and placed a gentle hand on his. "You do protect me, David. Just by being who you are. You've always supported me. And that's all I could ever ask for." The cab ride was quiet for a few moments as they processed their feelings. Margaret was grateful for her son's empathy, but she also knew that the conversation wouldn't end there. The incident on the flight had sparked something deeper within her, something she had known for years but had never fully confronted. The world was changing, slowly, but there were still many people like Claire, people who believed that their status gave them the right to judge others without understanding their lives or experiences. As they neared their destination in Atlanta, Michael's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw that a message had come through from a colleague. He quickly glanced at it, then put his phone down without saying anything. Margaret looked over at him, sensing his shift in focus. "Everything okay?" she asked. Michael nodded, but there was a slight tension in his shoulders. "Yeah. Just a message from work. It's nothing important." Margaret didn't press him further, but she could tell something was weighing on his mind. As they arrived at their family's home, Margaret felt the warmth of the reunion, surrounded by family who cared for her deeply. It was a welcome contrast to the negativity she had experienced earlier. Yet, in the back of her mind, the experience on the flight stayed with her, and the feeling of injustice, however small it may have seemed, lingered. That evening, after the family dinner, Michael found a quiet moment with his partner, Alex. They were sitting on the porch, the cool Atlanta evening air drifting in. Michael opened up about the flight incident, the way it had impacted his mother, and his own frustration with the system that allowed people like Claire to get away with such behavior. "She's been through so much, Alex," Michael said, his voice rough. "And it just doesn't stop. It's like there's this invisible barrier between people like her and the rest of the world. It doesn't matter how successful she is, how hard she's worked. There's always someone like Claire ready to remind her that she's not part of the elite." Alex listened, understanding Michael's frustration but also sensing the deeper emotional conflict he was struggling with. "I know it's tough," Alex said gently. "But you can't carry that burden for her. She's strong, and she's made it this far because of her resilience. But, yeah, it's unfair. It's frustrating. And it hurts." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of Alex's words. "I just want her to feel seen, you know. I want her to feel like she belongs. Like she's enough, just the way she is." Alex placed a hand on his shoulder. "She knows that, Michael. She knows you're with her. And she's proud of you, too." Later that evening, as the family gathered together, Margaret reflected on the day's events. The incident had reminded her of the deep-rooted biases that still permeated society, but it had also reminded her of the love and strength she had in her family. It wasn't just about the way others saw her, it was about the people who truly mattered, the ones who knew her for who she was and valued her beyond the surface. The conversation with her son had been emotional, but it also reminded her of the importance of family and solidarity in the face of adversity. She looked around the room at her family, feeling a sense of peace despite the turbulence she had faced earlier. The road ahead would be challenging, but Margaret was no stranger to perseverance. And with the support of her loved ones, she knew she could continue to rise above the prejudice that sought to define her. A few days later, Margaret found herself sitting quietly in her living room, a cup of tea resting gently in her hands. The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm golden glow through the windows. Her mind was still reflecting on the events of the past week, the confrontation on the flight, the moments of discomfort and realization, and the conversations that had followed. It had been a lot to process, but she had also begun to feel a sense of clarity emerging from the chaos. As she sat there, a soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Margaret set down her tea and made her way to the door, wondering who it might be. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Claire standing on her doorstep. The woman who had challenged her seat on the flight and made her feel as though she didn't belong in first class was now standing before her, a look of hesitation on her face. Margaret blinked in surprise, unsure of what to make of this unexpected visit. Claire seemed different from the woman Margaret had encountered on the plane. There was no arrogance in her posture now, no air of entitlement. Instead, there was a quiet humility, an almost apologetic aura that immediately caught Margaret's attention. "Hello," Claire said softly, her voice lacking the sharpness it had held on the plane. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Margaret studied her for a moment, sensing that something had changed in Claire. The woman seemed unsure, almost as though she were nervous about the conversation they were about to have. It was a stark contrast to the way she had acted on the flight, when she had been so quick to assert her supposed superiority. "No, you're not disturbing me," Margaret replied cautiously, her voice calm. "What brings you here?" Claire hesitated before speaking, looking down at her feet briefly before meeting Margaret's gaze. I wanted to apologize. For what happened on the plane. I didn't fully understand what was going on at the time, but after reflecting on it, I realize how wrong I was." Margaret's eyes softened slightly, though she still felt a sense of unease. She had expected Claire to apologize in some way, but this level of sincerity surprised her. The woman seemed genuinely remorseful. Margaret motioned for her to come in. "Please, come inside," Margaret said, stepping aside to allow Claire into her home. "Let's talk." Claire stepped inside, her body language still tentative, and Margaret led her to the living room, where they both sat down. Claire looked around the room, her eyes landing on the family photos that lined the walls, pictures of Margaret's children, and moments of joy from a lifetime of memories. Margaret gestured toward the photos as she sat down, her voice gentle. "I see you've been thinking a lot about this," Margaret began. "What made you come here today?" Claire shifted in her seat, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about it non-stop, actually. At first, I didn't understand why I had acted the way I did. I felt entitled to that seat, like I deserved it more than you. And then I saw your son stand up for you, and I realized that I had been wrong, not just in my actions, but in my thinking." Margaret watched her carefully, listening closely. "You realize it now, but what about before? What was it that made you feel like you had the right to treat me that way?" Claire took a deep breath, her eyes filled with regret. "I think it was my own assumptions. I've been privileged all my life, never having to question why I had access to certain things. I've always been a part of the elite, and I guess I just assumed that people like you didn't belong in the same spaces I did." She paused, her eyes downcast. "I can't believe I thought that way. I don't want to be that person." Margaret sat quietly for a moment, processing Claire's words. The apology was genuine, but the weight of what Claire had just admitted hung heavily in the air. Margaret knew that change didn't happen overnight, but this moment was important. Claire was confronting her own biases, and that, in itself, was a step forward. "Thank you for your honesty, Claire," Margaret said softly. "It's not easy to admit when we've been wrong. It's especially hard when we've allowed ourselves to believe something for so long. But recognizing it is the first step toward change." Claire nodded, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I want to make it right, Margaret. I want to learn from this, to be better. I know that my apology doesn't change what happened, but I wanted you to know that I regret how I treated you. I see you now. I see your dignity. And I want to do better." Margaret's heart softened further as she listened to Claire's words. She had lived a long life filled with moments of triumph and moments of pain, but she had never lost sight of what truly mattered. The value of respect and the importance of seeing others for who they really were, not for what society wanted them to be. In this moment, Margaret realized that, perhaps, Claire was beginning to understand that, too. "I appreciate your willingness to grow, Claire," Margaret said, her voice kind but firm. "But real change takes more than just an apology. It takes action. It takes the willingness to confront your own biases and change the way you treat others moving forward. It's something we all need to do." Claire's expression was thoughtful, her face a picture of determination. "I understand. And I want to do that. I want to change. I've already started. I've committed to making donations to educational causes that empower people from all backgrounds, including organizations that support teachers like you." Margaret was taken aback by this gesture, surprised at how deeply Claire had reflected on the situation. "That's a meaningful step, Claire," she said. "It's one thing to apologize, but it's another thing to put your words into action." Claire smiled faintly, a look of relief crossing her face. "I'm committed to doing better. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and hope. "Then, I believe you can be. We all have to work toward a better future, one where equality isn't just a concept, but a reality." The conversation continued for a while longer, with Claire asking questions about Margaret's life and experiences, listening intently as Margaret shared her thoughts on equality, dignity, and the importance of kindness. By the time Claire left, the air between them had shifted. The woman who had once challenged Margaret's place in the world was now someone who was ready to confront her own biases and work toward a better understanding of others. As Margaret closed the door behind Claire, she sat down once more in her living room, reflecting on the conversation. She had witnessed a transformation, small, but important, and it filled her with a quiet sense of hope. The world was changing, one conversation at a time, and maybe, just maybe, the seeds of a better future had been planted today. The next morning, Margaret woke up early, as she always did. The soft light filtering through her window, the birds chirping outside, and the scent of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen filled the air, bringing a sense of calm to her day. She stretched and walked to the kitchen, where Michael was already up, sipping on his coffee and scrolling through his phone. "Good morning, Mom," he said with a smile, looking up as she walked in. "I hope you slept well." Margaret nodded, feeling a bit lighter today. "Yes, I did. Thank you for asking." She poured herself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma soothing her. She could feel the weight of the past few days lifting, and though the memory of the confrontation with Claire was still fresh in her mind, she felt a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. As she sat down across from Michael at the kitchen table, he looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "So, how are you feeling after everything that happened?" he asked, his concern still evident in his voice. Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth. She had been reflecting on the events of the past week, processing everything she had learned and how it had affected her. "I'm doing better," she said finally. "The situation with Claire, it's still something I'm thinking about, but I feel like there's been some healing, some understanding. I've been carrying that weight for a long time, Michael, and it's not easy to let go of it." Michael's eyes softened as he listened to his mother. He could see the strength in her, even in moments of vulnerability. "I'm proud of you, Mom. The way you handled everything with Claire, it's not easy to confront those kinds of situations, especially when people are quick to judge." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I learn from the best," she said, reaching out to gently touch his hand. "You've always been the one who teaches me to stand tall, even when the world is trying to push us down." The conversation between them continued, shifting to other topics. They talked about the plans for the day, catching up on life, and Michael shared a few updates from his work. But even as the conversation moved on, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, within herself, and perhaps within the world around her. Later that afternoon, Margaret was sitting on her porch, enjoying the quiet. She had a moment to reflect, a rare luxury in the busy days she usually faced. Her thoughts wandered back to Claire's visit. It had been unexpected, but it had left her with a renewed sense of purpose. Claire's willingness to come to her, to apologize and show genuine remorse, had shifted something deep inside Margaret. It was one thing to face judgment from others, it was another to see someone actively seek growth, to confront their own biases and start the process of change. That act alone, more than anything, had given Margaret hope. She thought about how much had changed in her life. As a young teacher, she had fought for recognition, not just for herself but for her students. She had fought against a system that undervalued her, a system that had placed limits on people who looked like her, or who came from backgrounds similar to hers. And over the years, though she had seen progress, she had also seen the persistent undercurrents of prejudice, judgment, and bias. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the simple fact that Claire had admitted her wrongs and committed to making amends. Maybe it was the realization that change could come, slowly but surely, through real actions, not just words. Margaret had always believed that change was possible. She had seen it in her classroom, with the students she taught who came from all walks of life, who, despite their challenges, had the ability to succeed when given the right opportunities. Now, in a more personal way, she was seeing that change unfold in her own life. As the evening settled in and the sun began to dip below the horizon, Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had raised her children with the belief that the world could be a better place, that people could learn from their mistakes and grow. She had seen her son, Michael, do that time and time again, pushing boundaries and fighting for what was right. But now, she was witnessing it in Claire as well. There was something beautiful about that kind of growth, about the willingness to step out of one's comfort zone and confront the difficult truths. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she stood up, curiosity piqued. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see Claire standing there again, though this time, the tension was gone. Claire was holding a small envelope in her hands, her eyes earnest. "Hi, Margaret," Claire said, her voice warm and steady. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Margaret smiled, stepping aside to let her in. "Not at all. It's good to see you again, Claire. What brings you here today?" Claire hesitated for a moment before handing her the envelope. "I wanted to follow through with what I said," Claire said, her voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I've made a donation to a few educational causes that I believe in, and I wanted you to know. It's not much, but it's a start." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she took the envelope from Claire, and she opened it carefully. Inside, she found a check made out to a foundation that supported educators and underprivileged students. It was a significant contribution, one that reflected Claire's true intent to make amends and support causes that Margaret had spent her life fighting for. "Claire, this is—" "I don't know what to say," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you'll ever know. I never expected this." Claire's eyes softened, and she smiled. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted to show you that I'm serious about making things right. About being better." Margaret looked at Claire, the woman who had once looked at her with judgment and assumptions, now standing before her with a gift of real meaning. It was more than just a donation, it was an acknowledgement, a commitment to change. "I see you, Claire," Margaret said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. "And I believe you. Thank you for this. It means the world to me." As Claire left, Margaret stood at the door for a moment, the weight of the gesture sinking in. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the willingness to listen, to change, and to take responsibility for one's actions. And in that moment, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. Change was possible. One step at a time, people could grow. And she had witnessed it firsthand. The following days passed slowly but with a sense of purpose that Margaret hadn't felt in quite some time. She spent her mornings as she always did, quiet, reflective, enjoying her coffee in the stillness of the early hours before the world seemed to rush in. However, there was a new energy within her. The conversation with Claire and the realization that change could happen, even in small, seemingly insignificant ways, had sparked something deep inside. It wasn't just the apology or the donation that had moved her, though both were meaningful. It was the idea that people could recognize their flaws and actively seek to improve, something that had often seemed distant, almost unattainable. One morning, as Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea resting on the table beside her, her phone buzzed on the windowsill. She reached for it, glancing at the screen to see a message from Michael. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about the conversation we had the other day, and I think we should do something with it. I want you to share your story with a broader audience. It's important for people to hear what you've experienced, and how you've handled things with grace." Margaret smiled at her son's message, reading it again to make sure she had understood his intent. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for Michael, his support and belief in her had always been unwavering. But the idea of sharing her story publicly was something she had never considered before. She had always kept her struggles private, a part of her life that she carried silently, hoping to make a difference in her own way. Yet, Michael was right. Her story, her experiences, could help others. It could open doors for understanding, for change, and for the recognition of the struggles that so many others faced, struggles that were often hidden beneath the surface. She typed a quick response, her fingers hesitating for just a moment as she thought about the courage it would take. "Maybe you're right. It's not something I've ever done before. But I'll think about it." Margaret placed her phone down on the table, the weight of Michael's suggestion settling in her mind. She had lived her life with a sense of quiet dignity, never seeking the spotlight. But maybe now was the time. Maybe now was the moment to share her experiences, her pain, her triumphs, her lessons learned along the way. She knew that doing so would require vulnerability, and that was something she had never been entirely comfortable with. But she also knew that vulnerability could lead to connection, and connection was exactly what the world needed more of. The following week, as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. She had been thinking about what to write for days. She didn't want her words to sound preachy or self-righteous. She didn't want to present herself as a martyr, either. But she wanted people to understand the complexity of living in a world that often made assumptions about who she was, based solely on her appearance. She wanted them to understand that her life had been shaped by resilience, but also by a sense of quiet, enduring grace. As she typed, her words began to flow more easily than she had anticipated. She wrote about her early days as a teacher, how she had dedicated her life to educating children, helping them realize their potential. She wrote about the struggles she had faced in a predominantly white, male-dominated profession, the challenges of constantly proving her worth in a world that often overlooked her contributions. And she wrote about the moments of joy, when a student had succeeded against the odds, when she had helped someone find their voice. Those were the moments that kept her going, that made the struggles worthwhile. She wrote about the subtle and often invisible discrimination she had faced throughout her life, the way people would glance at her, make assumptions about her, and dismiss her based on her age or the color of her skin. And she wrote about the emotional toll that had taken on her. How, at times, it felt like an endless battle to prove she deserved to be where she was. And yet, in the midst of it all, she had remained steadfast, finding solace in her family and the quiet strength she had cultivated over the years. She also wrote about her experience with Claire. How, at first, the incident on the plane had felt like another example of the biases she had faced her entire life, another reminder that some people saw her as less than because of who she was. But she also wrote about the unexpected apology, the change she had seen in Claire, and how that had given her hope. It had reminded her that change was possible, not just in herself, but in others as well. When Margaret finished, she sat back in her chair, reading over her words. She felt a strange mix of pride and apprehension. This was the most personal thing she had ever written. The vulnerability she had shown in her story was immense, and she knew that once it was out there, she couldn't take it back. But she also knew that this was the right thing to do. It was time for her to share her truth. She clicked the send button and watched as her words were sent into the digital ether. She felt a sense of release, as though she had let go of a burden she had been carrying for years. But she also felt a sense of responsibility. Sharing her story wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been made to feel small, overlooked, or dismissed. It was about showing them that they weren't alone. The next morning, Michael texted her again. "Mom, I just read what you wrote. It's amazing. People need to hear this. I'm so proud of you." Margaret smiled, feeling a rush of warmth. She had no idea how her story would be received, but she knew that it had been the right decision. She had shared it not just for herself, but for others who might be going through the same struggles, the same quiet battles. And in doing so, she had taken another step toward healing, toward finding peace with the things that had once hurt her. Over the next few days, the response to Margaret's post was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out to her, sharing their own stories of discrimination and struggle. Some thanked her for putting into words what they had felt but never been able to express. Others expressed admiration for her strength, for the grace with which she had handled the challenges life had thrown her way. The story went viral in a way that Margaret had never expected. She had written it simply to share her truth, but now it was reaching thousands, perhaps millions. It was a humbling experience, but it also affirmed something she had known for a long time. Her story was important. The experiences she had lived through were shared by so many others. And by telling it, she had helped give them a voice. As the days passed, Margaret's phone rang with opportunities. People asked to interview her, to hear more about her journey, and to feature her in podcasts and articles. But it wasn't the attention that mattered to her. What mattered was the impact her story had. People were talking about change, about confronting their biases, about recognizing the worth of others, not based on appearance or assumptions, but on their humanity. Margaret continued to speak out, but she did so on her terms. She didn't need the spotlight, she needed the world to understand. And in time, she realized that she had given them a glimpse into her world. Through her story, she had shown that the fight for equality wasn't just about big gestures, it was about the small, everyday moments where we choose to see each other for who we truly are. As Margaret sat in her favorite armchair one evening, looking out at the world beyond her window, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had shared her truth, and in doing so, she had made a difference. The journey was far from over, but in this moment, she knew she had taken a step forward. And that was enough. Weeks had passed since Margaret shared her story, and the ripple effect of her words continued to unfold in unexpected ways. The response had been nothing short of overwhelming. Messages poured in from people across the country, from different walks of life, each one sharing their own stories, their own struggles with bias, discrimination, and the often invisible walls that separated them from opportunities and acceptance. Some of the messages were filled with gratitude, others with tears and confessions, but all of them were filled with a collective sense of solidarity. Margaret had never anticipated that her words would resonate so deeply. She had simply wanted to share her truth, to speak out about the quiet battles she had fought, the judgments she had endured, and the grace she had learned to carry. But as the days wore on, it became clear to her that she had tapped into something much bigger than herself, something that connected people from all over the world. Her story had become a bridge, linking those who had been made to feel invisible, those who had been made to feel less than, with others who had shared similar experiences. One afternoon, as Margaret sat at her kitchen table reading yet another message of thanks, Michael entered the room with a smile on his face. His presence had always been a source of comfort for her, and as he walked in, she felt the weight of the past few weeks lighten just a little. "Hey, Mom, how's it going?" Michael asked, taking a seat next to her. He glanced at the pile of letters and messages that had accumulated on the table. Margaret looked up at him, her heart swelling with pride. "It's been a lot, David. A lot of messages, a lot of stories. I never imagined that so many people would reach out." She paused for a moment, her voice softening. "It's been emotional, but also healing. I feel like I've connected with people in a way I never expected." Michael nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I knew it would resonate, Mom. But I think it's more than just your words. It's your heart. The way you've always been able to rise above the challenges and be a light to others, even when things were hard." Margaret smiled at her son's kind words, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had spent her life teaching others, pouring her heart into her work as an educator, and now, in this unexpected moment, it seemed that she had also become a teacher to those who needed it most. "But it's not just me, David," Margaret said, her voice growing more resolute. "This is about all of us. Everyone who's been made to feel less than. Everyone who's had to fight just to be seen. I may have shared my story, but the truth is, we all have stories that need to be heard." Michael's gaze softened, and he placed a hand gently over hers. "I agree, Mom. And I think it's time for us to take this further. I've been thinking about what you said, about sharing the stories of others, about continuing the conversation. What if we created a platform for people to share their experiences, to have their voices heard? It could be a place where people can connect, learn, and heal together." Margaret looked at her son, a sense of excitement beginning to stir within her. She had always been passionate about giving others the space to speak their truths, to help them feel heard and valued. "That's a beautiful idea, David," she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. "We've seen what's possible when we share our stories. Imagine how many more lives we could touch if we created a space for others to do the same." Michael smiled, his energy matching hers. "Exactly. We could create a platform that highlights the experiences of marginalized voices, a place where people can tell their stories and support each other. It could be a blog, a podcast, or even a social media page, whatever works. But the point is, we'll give people a place to feel seen. Margaret felt a deep sense of purpose stir within her. This was more than just a way to extend the conversation, it was a way to build something that could truly make a difference in the world. It would be a place where vulnerability was welcomed, where stories could be shared without fear of judgment. It would be a space where people of all backgrounds could come together and support one another, regardless of race, age, gender, or social status. As the idea began to take shape, Margaret felt a sense of pride and anticipation. This was a new chapter, a new opportunity to make a real, lasting impact. It wasn't enough to simply share her story. She wanted to create a movement, to amplify the voices of others who had been silenced for far too long. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and Michael worked together to bring their vision to life. They brainstormed ideas, developed a plan, and reached out to people who could help them make it happen. They decided to create a blog, one that would feature stories from people of all walks of life. It would be a place where people could share their personal experiences, struggles, and triumphs. They would encourage guest writers, host interviews, and provide resources for those who needed support. The blog would be a space for healing, growth, and connection. One of the first stories they featured on the blog was from Claire, the woman who had once judged Margaret on the plane. She wrote about her own journey of self-reflection and the steps she had taken to confront her biases. It was a powerful story, one that demonstrated the transformative power of acknowledging one's mistakes and working toward personal growth. Margaret was deeply moved by Claire's willingness to open up and share her own experiences. It was a testament to the power of vulnerability and the importance of creating space for people to change. As the blog gained traction, the response continued to pour in. People from all over the world shared their stories, offering words of encouragement and support. It became clear that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The platform became a community, one where people could find strength in one another, where they could learn from each other's experiences, and where they could collectively work toward a more just and compassionate world. Margaret couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment as she saw the impact of their work. What had started as a small idea between a mother and son had blossomed into something that was touching lives and inspiring change. It was a reminder that no matter how small the gesture, no matter how quiet the voice, every story mattered. And in sharing those stories, in creating space for others to be seen and heard, they had created a ripple effect that was far greater than they could have imagined. Margaret sat back one evening, looking over the blog's latest posts, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had fought for a long time to be seen, to be heard. And now, through her words and her actions, she had helped others find their voices too. In the end, it wasn't about her story alone, it was about the stories of everyone who had been made to feel invisible. It was about creating a world where no one had to fight to be seen. And as Margaret looked at the growing community of voices they had built, she knew that they had taken a powerful step toward making that world a reality. As the months passed, Margaret felt a quiet sense of fulfillment settling into her life. The platform she and Michael had built, where people could share their stories, had grown in ways they had never anticipated. What started as a small blog to provide a space for marginalized voices had turned into a thriving community, one that connected individuals from all walks of life. The stories that were shared on the site were raw, honest, and filled with courage. Each person's words, whether written or spoken, seemed to weave a tapestry of shared humanity. The blog became more than just a collection of personal narratives, it became a place for people to find healing, solidarity, and support. Margaret read every story that came in, often in the stillness of the evening after her busy days. Each one moved her in different ways. Some were heartbreaking, recounting the long battles against discrimination, while others were uplifting, filled with triumph and hope. But through it all, Margaret saw a common thread, the desire to be seen, to be heard, and to find a sense of belonging. Michael, too, felt proud of what they had built. He had always believed in his mother's strength and wisdom, but now, seeing her ideas come to life in such a profound way, he marveled at the impact they were making. The platform had given him a new sense of purpose, too. It wasn't just about building a successful business anymore, it was about making a difference, about using their resources to amplify voices that had been silenced for far too long. One evening, as they sat together in Margaret's living room, Michael turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, I've been thinking about how far we've come. This platform, it's bigger than we ever imagined. But we can do even more. What if we created an initiative? A scholarship fund for people who want to tell their stories, whether through writing, art, or any other medium." Margaret looked at him, her heart swelling with pride. The idea resonated with her deeply. She had always believed in the power of education and the arts as tools for expression and empowerment. Giving others the chance to share their stories in new ways seemed like the perfect next step. "That's a beautiful idea, David," she said softly. "We've built something incredible, but now, we can help even more people take their voices to the next level." As the idea began to take shape, they started planning the details of the initiative. They would partner with organizations that supported underserved communities, creating a scholarship fund that would help individuals who wanted to pursue storytelling through various creative mediums. Whether it was a young writer with a powerful voice or an artist who wanted to illustrate the stories of their community, the fund would help bring those dreams to life. The project was ambitious, but Margaret and Michael felt a sense of determination, knowing that their journey had just begun. Together, they were creating a legacy of empowerment, one where every voice had the opportunity to be heard. Margaret knew this wasn't just about them, it was about the countless others who would find their place, their story, and their purpose through the work they were doing. Looking out the window at the evening sky, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. They had come so far, but there was still so much to do. And with her son by her side, she knew they were only just getting started.